Hey guys, welcome back to Fix It Friday. So this week I've got something pretty rare and special for you guys to take a look at. And what we have here is a complete in-box, absolutely gorgeous Turbo Duo console. So for those of you guys that don't know, this is a version of the Turbografx 16, also known as the PC Engine. And what's nice about it is that it also has a CD-ROM unit also combined with it. So it's got a really nice, sleek, and stylish look. And these are pretty tough to find these days, especially the American version. The PC Engine Duo, the Japanese version is fairly common, but not this. And yeah, and not only that, like just the fact that this is also complete in box, and you can see everything, and it's absolutely stunning. So yeah, so I have this thing here because Turbo Duos inherently are broken these days. Like if you have a stock Turbo Duo that's never been worked on, chances are pretty high, like basically 100%, that part of it at least is not going to be working. The reason for this is that these consoles are notorious for having very bad electrolytic capacitors, and not only that, these capacitors do a fair amount of leaking, so they sometimes cut traces. They also sometimes damage the sound chips that are on the underside of the console. So repairing these can be really, really horrible. So today what we're going to do is we're going to unbox this thing and take a look at it. And then we're going to go ahead and open it up and see if we can get it back to its former glory. All right, well, let's get started. Okay, so let's go ahead and open this thing up. And I think the only thing I'm missing is actually the original power supply. The owner of this console has a Triad, but I even have the original plastic wrappers and styrofoam. So it's just really cool. You never see this. And if you do see a box, it's almost never this clean. Pretty huge instruction manual. I'm actually kind of impressed at how large this thing is. And it's got French, and it's got English. I presume that's for the Canadian market. Pretty cool. And here's the main event. Oof. Okay, and so here's the console. And you can see it has a little bit of cosmetic scuffs on it, so it was clearly used a decent amount during its lifespan, and I guess the original owner must have just kept the box and all the relevant materials with it. So yeah, as you can see, it has a really nice, sleek, stylish look, and it has its own controller. This controller is actually not compatible with the original Turbografx or the Turbografx CD. You need some kind of an adapter over here to make it work with those consoles. So it's literally identical in appearance and practically everything to the PC Engine Duo. All right, so let's go ahead and open this thing up and have a look inside. Okay, so I've got the Turbo Duo here, and I've already gone ahead and removed 5 gambit screws on the underside of the console, and so you just need one of these common gambit screwdrivers that you can pick up off of Amazon in order to do that. Once those are all gone, there's also like a little plastic clip here on the back, so when you lift it up, you kind of have to like push here just to get that out. And there may be, yeah, there's I think some clips on the front too, perhaps. Oh, I see. Make sure the games are out before you try to remove it. Oh, sorry for that. Okay, and so then the lid just comes off. And now you can see the entire unit here. And so you've got your CD drive here. I'm gonna go ahead and remove, there's like maybe 5 or so screws that hold the motherboard in place. And I also have to take this metal shielding off, and I have to desolder these 2 wires, which just connect this all up to ground. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that off camera and then have the board completely removed, and we'll have a good look. Okay, so I've successfully removed the Turbo Duo motherboard, and let's just have a look at how things are. So you can see that, you know, despite the fact that I'm sure all of these caps are in bad shape, there hasn't been a lot of leakage. So normally with a lot of leakage, you see some discoloration on the solder mask. Sometimes in this area right here, these are often in very bad shape, these 3 caps. Usually around the power supply too, like these capacitors over here tend to be bad. And again, I'm sure they're bad, but they haven't done massive leakage, at least as far as I can see here. So that's actually a really good sign. I'm hoping that means that all we need to do here is just replace capacitors, and this system will fire right up. It's also possible the laser might need to be adjusted, so we'll see. We'll have to get to that later. So for now, let me go ahead and show you how I remove these surface mount capacitors. There's really 2 methods that I use. Sometimes I use hot air and basically melt the joints and then just remove the cap. But you generally tend to need a decent amount of hot air because the corrosion from all the electrolyte makes it really hard for the solder to melt. And not only that, like you end up heating up all the nearby components, and sometimes they might even blow off if you're using too much air, like these little surface mount components. So as long as everything looks relatively healthy like this does, I tend to twist off the capacitors instead. So to do that, what you do is you hold the capacitor like this, and you just kind of go in one direction. It doesn't matter whether it's clockwise or counterclockwise. But the important thing is that you do not move up. You only go side to side only. And you can see that it just kind of comes right off like that. And you can actually see the remains of the legs still attached. They're right here and here. And the base of the cap is also still in place. So now at this point, I can come in and just snip away part of the legs and remove the base. And you can see that the rest of the legs are still here and the pads are perfectly fine and safe. And then at this point, I'll come in with some fresh solder and then just heat this whole thing up. This might smell really bad. Actually, it does because the electrolyte is all over the place here. Oof, that's terrible. You can actually see the electrolyte kind of burning on the edge here. Okay, so now the legs are off, and then usually I'll follow up with some desoldering braid, or sometimes with the Hakko desoldering gun. It just depends on my preferences and how many. I'll probably use the gun in most cases here because I have like 60 capacitors to replace. But I'll just show you here with the braid. You just come in with the braid and absorb all this stuff and get it out of here. There we go. And yeah, these pads look pretty good, all things considered. They're clean, and all of the junk and all of that like corroded solder is now gone. Of course, I need to come back here with some alcohol and just clean all of that off. So I'm gonna go do that real quick, and then we're gonna come back and solder on a new capacitor. All right, so you can see now that this whole area has been cleaned off with some isopropanol, and it's looking really good. So now we're ready to install the new capacitor. I will warn you though that if you see trace damage when you remove these caps, before you add a new capacitor, you should really test with a multimeter just to make sure that all the connections in the region are still there, that there's no cut traces. Because if there are cut traces, sometimes you might not be able to see that if the capacitor is on top of them. This case, we don't have any issues. We just have this one main rail here and then this one, and you know, everything is again in great shape. But I'm just warning you that while you're working on a Duo, there's areas where there might be cut traces actually underneath the capacitor. So you definitely want to confirm that before actually applying a new cap. All right, so let me show you how to do this. So you can see that there's a plus here. That means that the positive end of the capacitor goes here. The negative end goes here, which is usually marked by a stripe on the cap. So what I'll do is just add solder to one side only. And here's my cap with the negative side again facing in the correct way. And then I'll just use a pair of tweezers to hold it down, and then just heat the solder up and just slide it into place, just like that. So now that that one side is done, we're gonna just come in on the opposite side, tack it down. And I'm gonna actually use a little bit of flux just to make sure that the connections here are good. Okay, that's good. Okay, so that's one down and like 60 something to go. All right, so now I'm gonna go ahead and work on the rest of the board. I tend to go one value at a time, so I've already started with the 100 microfarad caps. So I'll probably start just chipping away at all of those first and then move on to another value. It just makes it easier so that I don't make a mistake with what used to be in that position. All right, so let's get started with that, and then we're going to move on to the next step. Okay, I just want to pause for a second and just show you guys a little bit of some of the work mid-progress here. So this is the power supply section of the PCB, and I just removed a whole bunch of caps here, and you can just see all of the electrolyte right over here. So yeah, that gives you an idea of just like how bad and unpredictable some of these PC engine duos and turbo duos can be. So you can see that there's just a lot of corrosion and spilled electrolyte here, especially this one right here. This is a 22 microfarad capacitor, and it was just absolutely gross. So I'm gonna have to go through this section very carefully, and before I even put the new caps on, I just gotta test the area above and below it with a multimeter and just make sure that there aren't any cut traces. Because once you put the capacitors on, you can't see this region anymore, and if there's a problem, you're not gonna know where it is. So yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and just finish cleaning this up. You can see it's cleaning up pretty nicely, but that doesn't necessarily mean anything. I'm still gonna have to go through and make sure all of this stuff is okay. There's also these chips right here, and these are important for sound. I believe they're for amplification, I'm pretty sure. There's two on the top, and there's also two on the underside. Sometimes these can go bad as a result of the electrolyte, or sometimes the traces to them can go bad. So you also gotta clean this area up as well. There's been times where I've actually had to desolder these, clean the whole area, and then resolder the chip back on. These don't look too bad, but I'm just giving you guys a heads up so that if you're working on this yourself, you know to actually check these two chips, and then there's two again that are right underneath. So yeah, I'm gonna keep working on this and we'll be back. Okay, so after a pretty decent amount of work, the surface mount capacitors have all been replaced. So like I was saying earlier, the area that was the worst on this board was the power supply. So this whole region had really, really bad ruined caps and a lot of corrosion and crap all over the board. So thankfully though, I was able to clean all of it up. There weren't any pads that were lifted, so that's great. I also took a look at the traces nearby or underneath these caps, and all of that stuff looked okay. So I think we're all set, and I ended up replacing all of those. It was also kind of bad in this area too. That's also a pretty common spot, and I think this capacitor too was really quite awful. But overall, this board was not too bad. I've seen much, much worse in the past. So now that that's done, we're gonna get to the last step, and that's gonna be just replacing all of these through-hole capacitors. This isn't nearly as bad as the surface mounts. They don't tend to leak or do any damage. The one thing you do have to do though is just heat up your iron a little more than normal. So what I find here is that I need to heat it up to about 850 Fahrenheit. And so here's just two right here I'm just gonna use as an example. And normally what I do is I kind of clip the leads a bit, because sometimes at the factory they're kind of bent into the via a little bit, and that makes it harder to pull the capacitor out or to get the desoldering gun in there. And so I have it heated up, and what I'm going to do is just heat up the via and just rock. So I've already moved that one, and there we go. That's it. I just heat them up and move the capacitor, and it just comes right out like this. So I'm going to go ahead and do that to all the remaining caps, clear out these vias with my desoldering gun, and then just replace all these caps. So let's get to it. Okay, so everything is finally done. So you can see all of the new surface mount and through-hole capacitors have been replaced. The only other thing I should mention is that when you replace these two over here, you have to kind of push them very flat to the PCB and as far away from this center area as possible. And that has to just do with the mechanisms that are on the underside of the plastic on the top shell. So these caps can't get in the way, or the shell just doesn't close right. So they're really kind of tight fit right over here. All right, so there's one more thing I need to do before I test, and that actually has to do with this little magnet right here. So to remove it, you just kind of push. So you see how there's like this inner ring here. This is the magnet, and then there's this outer plastic ring. That's what holds it in place. And if you go towards the back of the CD unit, you can just kind of push with your fingernail. Then this just comes right off, and now we've got the magnet. Now, the reason why I took that off is because I need to test. And if I need to adjust the laser, it's really impossible to do this with the top shell. So what I can do is put the CD in here, put this magnet on, and it'll be just as though there's a top shell. And then there's a little button here. This limit switch tells the console whether the door is open or closed. So you can just hold this down with one finger while it's running, and then you can do tests. All right, so let's hook this thing up to a TV and see if it works. Okay, so I've got the console plugged in, and I'm ready to give it a test. And so, yeah, let's see what happens with reading CD games. I have a copy of Rondo of Blood here just for testing purposes. So this could actually be the beginning of the repair. If this thing is out of alignment, I'll have to realign these potentiometers, which can be rather time-consuming and tricky. And I also don't know how the sound is. Maybe there's damage here, but I don't think so. Let's go ahead and see what happens. Okay, great. It turns on. So now I'm just going to hit run. Oh, that's beautiful. Spinning is a very good sign. It doesn't mean it's going to read, but at least it's spinning. Now it's reading. All right, perfect. Okay, this is looking really good. So this is how Rondo of Blood should start out. And we've got video, we've got sound. So yeah, I have a feeling this thing is totally repaired, which is phenomenal. I'm very lucky that it was just capacitors and there wasn't anything else on the board. Now, of course, I'm not really 100% sure that it's fixed. I'm gonna run this, play the game for a little bit. I'm also gonna try an audio CD because I have an audio CD where the data fills all the way to the outer tracks of the CD, and I definitely wanna test at the outer tracks and make sure that it can read all the way back there. Because if it can't, then that means that I do need to align these potentiometers. If it turns out that's the case, then I'll be back in a minute. But if not, then I'm gonna call this one fixed. All right, so that's it for this week's video. If you guys like this kind of content, then consider subscribing to the channel. I have videos out like this. I try to have them every Friday. And then of course, if you have something that you need repaired or modified, you can get me at oneuprestorations.com. All right, guys. Well, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next week.